Eternity, what is it? How can a mortal imagine the endless flow of time? But for Mark Mason, eternity lasted exactly 16 years, 3 months, and 17 days. It began with the gaze of his wife, Heitsi, who kissed Mark after he proposed. However, eternity was just as suddenly cut short when Mark witnessed Heitsi exchanging loving glances and kisses with another woman in a restaurant 2 blocks from their home. At first, Mark curiously observed the unfolding scene, but soon shock, disgust, and anger overwhelmed him. Fleetingly, he thought about a physical confrontation, but dismissed the idea, for one must not hit women. The couple immersed in their new tender relationship were oblivious, enjoying their meal and kisses. Mark, consumed by rage and helplessness, watched them as if observing a stranger's life. I was married to Heitsi for over 14 years, with 2 exceptional years before that, he reflected. But I never suspected she was changing her orientation. The revelation of his wife's bisexuality paled in comparison to his anger over her obvious infidelity, regardless of her partner's gender. Once Heitsi had accepted Mark's ring, he considered it the beginning of eternity. Who would have thought that some eternities have an expiration date? He bitterly smirked. After settling the bill, Mark got into his car and slowly drove home, pondering what had happened. Fortunately, he returned to his hometown earlier than planned, on a Friday evening instead of Saturday. I've been away since Monday, he thought, and besides missing Heitsi and the kids, being without intimacy for more than 3 days in a row left me with pent-up energy that needed to be released. Mark decided to stop for dinner on his way home, and became a witness to his wife's betrayal. Their children, 13-year-old Bianca and 9-year-old Joey, could easily be left alone for the evening if Heitsi had gone somewhere. However, Mark wondered if the girls were aware of the situation with their mother, since they hadn't mentioned anything. On the way, he analyzed what he had done wrong, how long it had lasted, and sometimes his thoughts took on a sarcastic tone. At least I don't have to worry that her lover is more worthy than I am. Mark entered the house at 9 p.m., but Heitsi was not there yet. His daughters greeted him joyfully, but he looked at them absent-mindedly, lost in anxious thoughts. When Heitsi returned 2 hours later, she must have noticed his car and tidied herself up a bit. Mark noted a change in her behavior. She seemed less content than usual. "What are you doing here so early?" Heitsi asked with concern in her voice. Mark playfully replied, emphasizing her surprised greeting. Heitsi frowned slightly. "If I had known you would come home earlier, I would have prepared something tasty." There was tension in her voice. Gradually exchanging words, the spouses felt the tension in the air growing. Heitsi continued to tell Mark that she had ordered pizza for the children, and she and Anne had chosen wine and sandwiches in the city center. Avoiding eye contact, she casually asked if he remembered Anne from her former office and if she had mentioned her before. Mark nodded affirmatively, although he understood the dishonesty of the question. Then Heitsi sarcastically described Anne as a blonde with a voluptuous bust, noting the trail of admirers she left behind. Heitsi herself could also gather a football team just by entering a room, thanks to her captivating effect not only on married women. Mark thought to himself that Anne possessed the charm of a goddess with her remarkable bosom. She was about 26 years old and had just started working at the insurance company where Heitsi used to work. The 2 women immediately became friends, and it seemed that even at 39, Heitsi could still turn many heads. She was also a blonde with a beautiful figure and seductive curves, just 10 pounds heavier than when they first met, but still had an excellent appearance. Despite the worried expression on her face, Heitsi was behaving calmly. Mark could barely stand on his feet, so he simply told her that he was tired and would go to sleep. She quickly pecked him on the lips as he passed by her and headed upstairs. Mark was almost certain he had tasted the flavor of love games on her lips. He went to bed but couldn't fall asleep. The children had gone to bed before him, so when he heard a quiet conversation a few minutes later, he realized Heitsi was talking to Anne on the phone. The conversation was short, and soon Mark heard Heitsi entering the shower in their main bathroom. Either he had startled her so much that she forgot about caution, or she thought he was asleep and wouldn't find out. During the rest of the weekend, Mark didn't have to interact much with Heitsi due to children and household chores. On Saturday evening, she wanted to have a family dinner, but he left abruptly, cutting the conversation short. Heitzi must have sensed that something was wrong, as Mark rarely acted so abruptly and uncommunicative with her. On Monday morning at work, Mark asked his boss Drake for a day off due to personal problems. Having gone through a divorce and remarriage himself, Drake understood what had happened in Mark's family. Considering Mark's recent successful business trip, he didn't object to the day off and even handed him his divorce lawyer's business card. "I regret the unexpected turn in your relationship with Heitzi," Drake said. Mark thanked him for his understanding, "and I saw a future with a long-lasting relationship with Heitzi." Following his boss's advice, the next day Mark consulted the lawyer. She showed care for his emotions and offered gentle guidance. The lawyer was surprised when Mark decided not to hire a private detective to gather evidence of Heitzi's infidelity. "In a no-fault state, such evidence may not carry much weight," she explained. "The main issue would be potential visitation rights difficulties, although I'm sure that won't be a serious problem for you." Being at home near the girls was unbearable for Mark. The minimal interaction with Heitzi hinted that she felt it. The children also noticed the unusual silence between their parents. Mark gave Heitzi plenty of chances to talk, but she never took the opportunity. Mark himself couldn't bring himself to start the conversation first. The situation escalated when Heitzi was handed a summons at work the following week. Mark wanted her to experience at least a fraction of the pain he felt, which could be called revenge on his part. He assumed that she was given the summons around 12:03 because his phone started ringing continuously at 12:05. Mark ignored all 14 calls from Heitzi and several calls from unknown numbers, suspecting that she might be using friends' phones to contact him. To his surprise, for the first time since discovering Heitzi with Anne, he felt a surge of energy, and he had a surprisingly good day. When Mark arrived home at 17:35, Heitzi's car was already in the garage. She didn't immediately hide her presence, expressing anger. "How dare they hand me this summons in front of my friends and colleagues?" Heitzi exclaimed. Mark remained silent until he entered the house and put his things down. In the living room, the girls seemed engrossed in a movie on the big screen. "I wanted you to be served the summons along with your lover, for your own comfort," he calmly said. Heitzi's anger turned into tears. Mark countered. "What do you know about Anne? You were not careful at all." He asked her 2 questions. "How long did your relationship last? And when were you planning to tell me?" Heitzi admitted. "It lasted about 6 months. We were planning to tell you soon." In less than 30 seconds, her behavior changed from venomous to defeated. She wearily sat down at the kitchen table. Mark walked to the bar, took a bottle of Buffalo Trace bourbon, poured himself a double glass, and sat across from her. If looks could kill, Heitzi would have died in the first 2 seconds. Mark watched as she couldn't tear her eyes away from the table. "How could I not know about your bisexuality all this time?" he asked quietly. "I only found out about it recently myself," replied Heitzi. "It just happened, I didn't plan it." Finally, she looked at him. "This shouldn't change anything between us. I love you, but I need to explore this new aspect of myself. Please support me and give me time," Heitzi requested. "Isn't 6 months enough for your exploration?" Mark asked in surprise. "If you truly love me, then remember our vows and don't even consider such an idea. Fidelity transcends gender. But true love can forgive a mistake," Heitzi retorted. "One time is a mistake, but 6 months is a conscious decision." Mark answered fervently. "Love doesn't give you the right to break my heart and jeopardize our family. Your actions have nothing to do with gender, you're just self-centered." "You're whining," Heitzi parried. Mark doubted her love. "Now you love me as a child, a friend, or a pet, but not as a man." Perhaps these words were spoken in haste. He had poor self-control. When Heitzi denied this, Mark shouted, "Stop! I know what I saw, and I know you better than anyone." She looked guilty, realizing that Mark had seen them with Anne together. Heitzi quickly tried to salvage the situation, but Mark stood his ground. "That doesn't change the fact that you love someone else, not me. Everything could have been different if it was a man, then I could have talked to him." "Can't we be civil?" Heitzi asked. Of course, Mark acknowledged the painful truth. But in that case, my wife was stolen by her female lover, the woman you fell in love with. Several months later, Mark found out that the children knew nothing about Heitsi's affair. They thought Aunt Anne was just a close friend of their mother. The children saw them kissing and tenderly touching each other, but since Aunt Anne was a woman, they didn't find anything reprehensible in it. Mark found out about it when one evening they went out to dinner with the children, and the kids mentioned that Aunt Anne started being home more often after he moved out. It seemed like they were starting to suspect that Aunt Anne was one of the reasons for their parents' divorce. Since they lived in a no-fault state, Mark and Heitsi's finances were practically split evenly. He had to pay child support. Heitsi got the house until the kids went to college, and Mark, of course, had to pay child support for their upkeep. He moved to an apartment 15 minutes away from the former home. Honestly, Mark was completely crushed. After the divorce, they stayed in touch through the children. The girls were involved in many school and extracurricular activities, and Heitsi and Mark tried their best to support them as much as they could. For some reason, Heitsi stubbornly resisted the divorce, and the process dragged on for a whole year before they finally finalized it. Mark behaved politely, no more, when he encountered Heitsi and Anne at their daughter's events. He was always invited to family gatherings, but knowing that Heitsi would be there, he would apologize and leave. Mark understood that he was missing out on wonderful family memories, but he had to make huge efforts to maintain composure around Heitsi and Anne. Instead, he arranged separate days for the children to give them gifts on their birthdays and Christmas. As expected, each of them kept friends they had before the marriage. Almost all the friends they made after the wedding stayed with Heitsi. Many of them somehow feel awkward around you, considering that you lost your wife to another woman, one of the husbands explained to Mark. The general opinion was that Mark somehow deserved it, and some of their mutual married friends expressed this opinion directly. Mark let them go without a fight, because as the old saying goes, in difficult times you find out who your true friends are. By his own choice, Mark didn't date much in the following years. His heart, of course, was not ready for this, and he did not require much social interaction. After a year of solitude, he went to the local animal shelter and adopted a 3-year-old German Shepherd. "I want to see the 3 dogs that have been with you the longest," Mark asked the staff. The one he chose had been at the shelter since she was a puppy, but after numerous rejections, she became a quiet, withdrawn animal with the saddest eyes Mark had ever seen. "We were kindred spirits because we were both rejected," he reflected. The dog's name was Bob, not a cute name, just Bob. Bob caught Mark, and Mark caught Bob. After inspecting the apartment, Bob climbed onto the couch with Mark and curled up next to him. Bob got along well with the girls Mark sometimes invited over, but it seemed he enjoyed it most when they were alone. The dog loved going for walks or rides with Mark, and they could discuss anything. True, Bob mostly stayed silent during these conversations, but Mark could tell from his expression and ears that the dog was listening attentively. Several years later, Mark's eldest daughter Bianca met a guy from Boston in college and married him. Since Mark had succeeded in his career as an engineer, he could afford to give his daughter a dream wedding. He proudly walked her down the aisle, but after the ceremony, Bianca reproached him for messing up his only line. "I realized it during the rehearsal, but in the actual moment, my voice faltered," Mark admitted. Instead of saying the expected, "her mother and I," he simply replied, "I," when asked who gives Heitsi away. "I was almost choked up with emotion," he explained the reason for the slip. Sitting next to Heitsi, Bianca quietly remarked, "That was awful, and you knew it." Anne, sitting next to Heitsi, boldly stared at Mark. "Forget about it," he quietly told her, checking to see if the pastor noticed their exchange of remarks. Wedding ceremonies always evoked memories in Mark, and at first he warmly remembered his own wedding. But it didn't last long. After 30 seconds, he pictured Heitsi and Anne together in the restaurant when he found out about their relationship. Coming out of his reverie, Mark noticed Heitsi looking sadly at him. She blushed and quickly looked away. Apparently, she too was lost in memories. Although Mark wasn't trying to observe, he noticed that Heitsi and Anne were having a great time with Bianca, her husband Jerry, and practically all the other guests. Then Mark realized that he was one of the few lonely people over 50 in the room. Feeling sorry for himself, he approached the open bar and ordered a glass of 18-year-old Irish whiskey. Taking his glass, Mark sat at his table and quietly patted himself on the back for orchestrating such a grand celebration. 3 years later, Mark was once again to play the role of the father of the bride when his younger daughter Joey got married. This time, he decided not to go alone and finally made a concerted effort to meet someone. Returning home from a 3-day trip 3 weeks later, Mark stopped at a small bar restaurant about an hour's drive from his apartment. Although he usually avoided such places because of his dislike for country music, the barbecue pork advertisement enticed him to go in. The food was excellent, and when the DJ started playing music around 8 in the evening, Mark looked around for someone to chat with. And then, a 30-year-old African-American woman of stunning beauty appeared at the door. Why is such an attractive unmarried young lady alone in this bar? Mark wondered to himself, acknowledging that he himself was just an old man. Knowing that she was probably too young for him, he still motioned to the bartender. "Whatever this lady orders, put it on my tab." The bartender informed the woman that her drink was paid for, and she approached Mark's table to thank him. "My name is Jody," she introduced herself when Mark invited her to sit down. To his surprise, Jody sat down next to him. After a pleasant evening, Jody unexpectedly suggested going to her place. Without hesitation, they headed towards the exit, but a man in a cowboy hat approached Jody and lightly kissed her on the cheek. "This is my husband, Fred," Jody reassured the bewildered Mark. "Maybe he'll join us and watch?" Fred smirked, looking straight at Mark. Something is clearly amiss in this situation, Mark expressed his discomfort. "I belong to a different generation and cannot grasp modern quirks." He raised his hands, indicating that he was ending the conversation, and walked towards his car. In another attempt to find company, Mark turned to his church. He got along well with Sharon, a 50-year-old divorced woman with long black hair, tall chest, long legs, and a big smile. After a few dates, they returned to Mark's apartment, which led to intimacy. However, during the intimate moment, Sharon started muttering her ex-husband's name, JC. The situation escalated when she began shouting his name loudly at the peak of pleasure. "I'm not JC," Mark immediately stopped, explaining the reason. In response, Sharon expressed sincere displeasure. "Why did you stop?" In a silent atmosphere, Mark drove her home, and, of course, they never met again. For the next date, Mark invited his colleague Margaret Webb for an evening of food and dancing. The lively 44-year-old divorced brunette with a large chest and voluptuous figure had been a longtime friend in the office. By that time, they both knew each other's sad stories. After several wonderful meetings, they made love for the first time and sincerely enjoyed each other's company. Anticipating his daughter's wedding, Mark invited Margaret to be his companion. She reacted seriously. "I'm not sure it's worth accompanying you to your daughter's wedding, considering your family situation with your ex-wife. You'll need approval from Bob, my 45-pound partner, a German shepherd with exquisite taste," Mark joked. "If Bob doesn't approve of you, you won't come with me to the wedding," Margaret laughed. But after Bob approved of her, she agreed to be Mark's companion, much to the joy of his daughter. However, Heitzi seemed displeased, constantly throwing disapproving glances at Mark. Since he had little interaction with his ex-wife, he ignored her opinion, but it worried Margaret, sensing Heitzi's animosity. At the rehearsal dinner, Mark finally confronted Heitzi directly. "What's the problem? I don't like your Girl Scout." Heitzi sarcastically replied, expressing contempt towards Margaret. "Jealousy doesn't suit you," Mark retorted. "Margaret, you and Anne are peers. Besides, you traded me for a younger female version." Heitzi smirked, involuntarily acknowledging her ex-husband's wit. A year later, Margaret became Mark's second wife, and life went on. Truth be told, he had completely forgotten that he was on the bone marrow donor registry when he received a call at work informing him that after 30 years, he could be a donor for someone. Delighted at the opportunity to save someone's life, Mark knew that the bone marrow extraction would be somewhat uncomfortable, but his heroic nature made him willingly agree to the procedure. Additional testing was required, and if successful, the extraction would be scheduled for 2 weeks later. Giving his consent, he told them he was ready. Although Mark wasn't very religious, He believed in God, and there were old words about God working in mysterious ways. He didn't think much about it until a week later when he spoke on the phone with his eldest daughter, Bianca, during their weekly conversation. "Dad, Aunt Anne found a suitable bone marrow donor," Bianca reported. "Mom and her are very happy and actively involved in the process." Mark asked Bianca to convey his best wishes to Anne and his ex-wife Heitzi, despite the pain he had caused them. "You're an adult now and can contact them yourself," Bianca warned. "The less I talk to them, the less likely I am to say something unpleasant that I will regret later," Mark replied. Bianca urged him to make peace with the divorce, emphasizing that he had been happily married to Margaret for almost 2 years. Mark acknowledged his happiness but shared that, although he no longer hated Heitzi, she was not among his close friends. He decided to send her flowers with good wishes for a speedy recovery. Later, as he was ordering the bouquet, a thought struck Mark: the rarity of bone marrow tissue identity, and the coincidence that Anne found a donor around the same time seemed too convenient to him. Recognizing the anonymity in the donation process, he pretended to be optimistic and asked his contact at the registry how likely it was that his donor lived in the same city. She hesitated and admitted that it was the first time someone had identified a donor by coincidence. Mark realized that he would most likely be donating bone marrow to Heitzi. Angered by the situation, he pondered how Heitzi had stolen his wife, never apologized, and now expected him to save her life. Mark decided that it wouldn't happen. 2 days later, he called his secretary and said he was refusing to donate. She almost cried. "Is there any specific reason why you refused?" she asked anxiously after a pause. "You understand that although you have the right to refuse, it is almost never done and will cause great concern?" "I apologize for causing horror, but it is in my own interests to refuse," Mark replied. She muttered that she regretted it and told him to call her if he changed his mind. Margaret was furious when Mark told her he had refused to donate, without explaining that he had found out who the donor was. "You are a good person and always do the right things," she exclaimed. "Backing out in this case is wrong." Later, Margaret organized a family dinner with Heitzi and the sick Anne. Mark was clearly the only one who did not know about the meeting. When everyone gathered, he asked who would speak first: Margaret, who organized the meeting without his consent; Daisy, who broke his heart many years ago; or Anne, who stole a married woman and now needed a chance at life. At these words, Mark looked at each woman in turn. Bianca took the initiative. "Dad, I understand your anger towards Mom and Aunt Anne, but refusing to donate bone marrow is a childish and petty act beneath you. Seeking revenge by depriving someone of a chance at life is wrong. It involves a person's life, not a frivolous act." Mark took a sip of whiskey and shook his head. Every action has consequences. Daisy and Anne never expected such serious consequences, but now they want to shift their problem onto me. I have been given an unexpected opportunity to make changes in the life of the one who wronged me. For me, it's a way to restore self-respect. How much can there be, if helping the one who stole my wife survive? Anne tried to look him in the eyes. "I beg you, don't let me die. The chances of survival are slim if you don't donate bone marrow." But Mark was firm. "No, that will not happen. I will not do anything to help this woman." Daisy burst into tears. Margaret whispered, "I will try to talk to him." Mark took the keys and left while the women cried. He did not return for 3 days, ignoring Margaret's calls and the children. When he came back, the house was empty. Margaret had left with some of her things. Mark also packed a suitcase and left the engagement ring on the kitchen table. 3 days later at work, Mark received an anonymous call, which turned out to be from Margaret. "Are our relationship really ending because you acted like the biggest idiot?" she asked incredulously. "And are you surprised that I'm married to someone who completely undermined my trust?" Mark parried. "We both could have fixed the situation, and if anyone sought revenge, it was not me, but perhaps a higher power." He quoted a biblical saying, "Vengeance is mine, and I will repay." Mark criticized Margaret for her actions and noted that she behaved disgustingly. Anne passed away 2 months after their official divorce, and Mark learned about it from an obituary in the local newspaper. He did not keep track of her affairs, and none of his daughters kept him informed. Despite the estrangement from his daughters after the confrontation, Mark stood firm in his conviction and position not to help Anne, and neither he nor his girls backed down. He was confident that he had made the right decision for himself. Mark was never tormented by guilt for not giving Anne his bone marrow. The bone marrow registry did not quite understand Mark's individual situation and completely crossed him off the list. This suited him just fine, as the likelihood of finding a second compatible donor was extremely low. His old dog Bob was a bit grumpy and displeased with the women Mark brought home over the past year, but after 60, he wasn't really looking for a third wife. However, to his surprise, Mark still received his share of intimacy. He learned that at this age, there were about 4 times more suitable women than men, and if they were in good health, they willingly agreed to nighttime fun. Of course, they couldn't frolic too vigorously anymore. After all, no one wanted to break a hip. But most of the time, both partners enjoyed spending a pleasant evening together. Mark jokingly referred to his temporary girlfriends as beautiful elderly she-wolves. Mark had not spoken to anyone in his family for over 4 years. When his youngest daughter, Jo, called to inform him that Heitzi had passed away a few days ago, she thought her father should know and invited him to the funeral. Mark and Heitzi had 16 years of life together and 2 children, so he decided it was worth at least attending. Perhaps he will be able to improve his relationships with the girls. At the funeral, Mark sat alone on the side. The ceremony went well. After it, he approached the daughters and their families. The girls timidly hugged him, their husbands shook his hand, and the grandchildren greeted him shyly. They went to the nearest restaurant to talk. About 3 minutes later, Bianca broke the silence. Why was Aunt Anne allowed to die? She sharply asked, and Mark noted that the tone of the conversation hadn't changed in 4 years. Anne was a thief of other women, and this will be the last time we discuss this issue, he cut her off. Changing the subject, Mark pointed to a young man at the bar. Imagine if he kissed Bianca. What would you do, Jerry? I would cause him definite harm, Jerry replied without hesitation. And if there was an affair between him and Bianca? He would be dead, declared Jerry. Then you wouldn't have to worry about bone marrow donation for him if he got sick, Mark remarked. I didn't partly save Anne's life because she was a woman. Perhaps it was a mistake, but I shouldn't have saved the life of a man connected to my wife or who stole her. Jerry nodded in agreement, and Mark saw understanding reflected in the eyes of those present. I'm not proud of my decision, but I'm not ashamed of it, he said quietly. Anne didn't deserve my compassion after stealing the love of my life. But how could you lose compassion for someone you once loved? Joey asked. I truly loved your mother deeply, Mark admitted. But when she broke my heart, much of that love turned into hatred. I was just a man with my weaknesses, not a monster as she portrayed me. Her fate and the fate of her friend did their work. Tears welled up in the eyes of the adults present, and the children looked puzzled. Mark realized they would all need time to come to terms with it. He suggested not dwelling on the past, as